somewhere in the middle. And that leads us into our next element of art, which is color. So how do we see color? This is kind of a science question. What we need in order to see color is a light source to shine its beautiful rays down, and it's going to hit an object, whatever that may be, and that spectrum, the light spectrum, if you remember, white light is a combination of all of the colors put together. So as that white light shines down onto an object, parts of that spectrum bounce back. So the parts that bounce back end up in our eyes, and then all those cones and rods do all their little sciencey stuff and interpret the color, and it sends all of those little brain waves to us, and it's like, oh hey, that's a color. Let's simplify that a bit. I'm not a scientist, clearly, but color is basically seen by light reflecting off of an object. That's a lot easier.
Okay, so I would like you to write down color and then box that in. Since it's one of our elements of art. Then seen by light reflecting off an object.
What are some words that we can use to describe different colors? First of all, hue would be the name of a color. Think things like red or blue or green or turquoise or mauve. The next word that we can use to describe colors would be intensity. So intensity is either the brightness or the dullness of a color.
All right, so hue, write down hue. This time underline it. The name of a color. It's also pure color. And then intensity. The brightness or dullness of a color. All right, so here, this is what we're going to write.
We can also call this saturation. So if a color is really intense and vivid and bright, then it would be very saturated. If it's very dull and dingy, it would be desaturated. So it would not have a lot of intensity to it. But when we look at artworks, we can use all kinds of different adjectives to describe colors. So
Okay, so on the next page, page 5, so I am going to stop sharing for a second. Page 5, go ahead and label it. Okay. And then I want you to write down. Okay, I want you to write down adjectives that describe color. And she is going to go through a couple different paintings and talk about different ways that you could possibly describe those paintings. Just write down as many adjectives as you can.
So here we have two very different artworks by Janet Skates and Hannah Woodman. So when we look at Janet Skates' art, what words could we use to describe these colors without naming the hues? We could say they're very bright, they're intense, they're vivid, they're saturated. Perhaps we could say they're playful or happy colors. If we look at Hannah Woodman's painting, we might consider her colors maybe muted or neutral or desaturated. Maybe they're darker. Some areas are bright. You could say some of the colors are dull. So there are lots of different adjectives that we can use to describe colors. Now let's talk about another element of art, and that is space. So when we talk
Stop for a second. Just make sure that you've wrote down some adjectives. You can even add your own if you'd like to. You know how I like to put borders around everything. And so put something like adjectives that describe color. Okay. All right. Good. Now the next one is space. Go back to sharing my screen. I'm going to take it back just a tiny bit.
another element of art, and that is space. So when we talk about space, we're not talking about outer space. We are talking about the space inside of an artwork. So space in art would be the area around, above, or inside an object. Now,
Okay, so write that down. The area around, above, or inside an object. If you can hear all that tap dancing below, that is my dog Kiki. All right.
now there are two types of space. There's space that involves depth, so how far things go back or forward in space. And then there's also space that involves the shape of areas in an artwork. So the first kind we're going to talk about involves depth. So with shallow space, there's not much depth in the artwork. So if we think like a puddle is kind of shallow, meaning.
Okay, so we are going to go back just a little. And you are going to write down there are two types of space. I'm going to give it a little starburst next to it. There are two types of space. And then next to that, we're going to write the two types of space. So we have space that involves, let me just play it again.
Space that involves the shape of areas in an artwork. So the first kind we're going to talk about involves depth.
So depth is the first type. but now she's going into shallow space. So within space, there's more definitions, right? So just because there's different types of space. After you've written this, you need to write down shallow space, because she's going to define it. This is really important to us in ceramics, since we spend a lot of time playing around with depth. I'm going to underline it.
So with shallow space, there's not much depth in the artwork. So if we think like a puddle is kind of shallow, meaning you don't go down very far in it, right? So there's not a lot of depth to it. In an artwork, when we have shallow space, objects are close together without much room to move around.
So please write this. There is not much depth in the artwork. Objects are close together without much room to move around. So this is what my page looks like so far.
So here are a couple artists with artworks that involve shallow space. Andy Goldsworthy and Utagawa Kunishida. So very different artists for sure, but when we look at their artworks, we can see that we can't go very far into the artwork. It kind of stops. It's almost like it hits a wall. The objects, or in Kunishida's artwork, the people are very close together. It feels kind of cramped, and you can't go very far back into the picture. It feels kind of flat. When an artwork feels flatter, then it would be considered shallow space. So if shallow space means that there's not a lot of depth in an artwork, what do you think deep space means? Clearly, it would be the opposite. So deep space means there's a lot of depth in the artwork. And when we look at artworks with deep space, we tend to see objects disappearing far in the distance, or it feels like there's a lot of room to move around. You can maybe frolic in the artwork. So we're going to look at two more.
Okay, I'm going to stop that. Write down deep space. There is a lot of depth in the artwork. Objects tend to disappear. Far in the distance.
More artworks by the exact same artists, but this time they're incorporating deep space. So when we see Andy Goldsworthy's art, we see these objects going far in the distance. Same with Kunishida's. The figures.
Do you have a question? You have to go?
Yeah, I gotta go help Ray.
Okay.
But I'll see you in a little while.
All right. So you're gonna have dinner out with them and everything?
Yeah, don't worry about
Okay.
it. Thanks.
All right.
Bye, Tim. I'll be back.
two more artworks by the exact same artists, but this time they're incorporating deep space. So when we see Andy Goldsworthy's art, we see these objects going far in the distance. Same with Tunisi does. The figures have a lot of room to move around as they're having their snowball fight. And we see the landscape going even further back in the distance. So there's a lot of depth taking place in these images. Now, the second type of space that we're going to talk about is no longer about depth per se, but it's about kind of the shape of the areas of space in an artwork. So that would be positive space and negative space. So when we talk about
Okay, so I'm going to just stop for a second. And back here it says there are two types of space. There's depth and let's see. Shape of space. I hope this makes sense later. Okay. All right. So I'm going to flip my page because I'm going to run out of room here. So I'm going to move on to page 6. You should do the same so that we're kind of in the same pages. If you write small and you end up with a lot of room at the bottom, just follow along, okay? It'll give you places to doodle later on. Okay, so now I'm on page 6. All right, share my screen again. Back it up just a little bit.
the areas of space in an artwork. So that would be positive space and negative space. So when we talk about positive space, we're talking about the areas of focus, and those are the important parts of an artwork. So generally the things that the artist wants you to look at first, that would be the positive space. Whereas negative space would be the space around the areas of focus, and that's usually the background of an artwork. So we're going to see a fun example of positive and negative space in graphic design.
Okay. Unfortunately, the captions are across the top of that. So, all right, positive space, the areas of focus. The important parts of an artwork. It's also known as the space within the objects, but that's not always true. So her definition is more accurate. And then,
whereas negative space would be the space around the areas of focus, and that's usually the background of an artwork.
let me just get rid of that. There we go. Okay, so negative space. Again, we're just underlining these. The space around. Oh, my handwriting's starting to get a little sloppy. Around areas of focus. Usually the background of an artwork. Okay. Then I like to go back and make my letters a little more bold. Maybe even pull out the highlighter with the colored pencils. Everything stand out.
So we're going to see a fun example of positive and negative space in graphic design. So you may have seen the FedEx logo before. Some of you may already know what I'm about to say, but when we look at the logo, so the letters themselves would be the positive space. So they're the areas of focus. However, the person who designed this logo did something clever with the negative space. So the way they arranged the letters and kind of put them together to create this logo ended up creating an arrow between the E and the X, as you can see right there. So once you see it, you can't really unsee it, right? So what's clever about that is, arrows tend to imply motion, and FedEx is a shipping company. So when you look at this logo, your brain sees that arrow, whether you know it or not, and it might subconsciously think to itself, oh, they must ship things really fast. I don't know why I think that, but clearly I think that for some reason. And it's because your brain notices that space, that arrow there, and thinks about motion. So you're like, oh. So basically, graphic designers are messing with your brain, and that's pretty wild. All right, we're going to look at an artwork by M.C. Escher, too, to talk about positive and negative space. So Escher was really a master of playing with positive and negative space in what he calls his tessellations. So as we go across the image, whether from right to left or left to right, what originally is the negative space slowly transforms into the positive space of the image. And he does this in a lot of his different artworks, and just to kind of mess with your brain. So he liked to create a lot of different illusions in his artwork.
Okay, here is your first drawing exercise. You are going to need to go to your folder and find a piece of drawing paper. It's this thick white paper in there. If for some reason you don't have the paper, you can use regular copier paper. Please don't use line paper for this. It needs to be drawing paper or plain copier paper. Okay. You are going to fold this in half. It really doesn't matter which direction. So I'm going to fold it hamburger style. Let me switch my cameras. All right, and let's focus. Focus it. Come on. Does not want to focus. It's like worse. Okay. Try a pencil, maybe it'll focus on a pencil. No. Super weird. Okay. I don't know why it's not focusing. I don't know what's going on. All right. Let's switch cameras again then. Okay, technology, so much fun. All right. Okay, so I'm gonna pause for a second. Okay, here we go. I am going to fold my paper in half. Again, it doesn't matter which way you fold it. Folding it hamburger style, and I'm kind of cleaning up that edge. And then I'm gonna flip it the other way, same thing. My goal is to cut this paper in half. You do this a few times. You can use scissors to cut it, or let's see, just put a little tear in it, and then if I pull it, there we go. Now we have two pieces. So we're going to use one right now, and we'll use the other piece later. So I'm going to stick this back into my folder. Right. All right, here's what we're going to do. You have your piece of paper, you're gonna need a pencil, you're gonna need your pen. Right. You are going to do a study of positive and negative space. So I want you to go outside right now and find some leaves or flowers that will fit on this half sheet, and we'll leave some space around it. Don't fill it up. This is probably good. If you can't go outside, then look around your house. Maybe go get some forks, a spoon, something like that. Stay away from just markers as objects. This might work though. If you're going to do office supplies, we want it to be recognizable, whatever it is. So we'll know that's a roll of tape. However, you may not realize that this is an eraser if you try to use this. You'll see what I mean in a second. All right, from here, I am going to sort of trace. You know, I wonder if I can just use the shadow underneath to trace my leaf. Yeah, that works. I'm not going to make my lines really dark. It's not the perfect solution, but it seems to be doing it. And then I'm just kind of looking underneath and trying to see the shadow. You may have to adjust your light for this. You could just also just kind of go around the leaf. Let's see where I am. All right, there's that. And then I want the stem because I think that looks kind of cool. Okay, a light drawing there. We're going to know that's a leaf. Again, be school appropriate with your plant life. Yes. Even if you're from Canada. Okay. And this is going to take up a lot of space. That's all right. Having large shapes and medium shapes and small shapes give us variety. This is just a drawing exercise, so I'm not trying to get you to stress out about it. But here is what we're going to do next. So we are going to ignore the inside of these shapes. We are going to focus on the outside. Whoop, come on. Speaking of focusing, see if that focuses. Okay, let me pause this for a second. All right, back to this. I think what's happening is my light's kind of low because it's evening when I'm recording this. All right, so now I have all these shapes in here. I am going to take my pen, so there's no going back. And I am going to start adding designs to the outside. I'm going to just pick an area. Do not outline your shapes. It ruins the illusion. I'm going to widen my lines. Now you can do it very different. There will be some examples at the end of this video, as long as the power doesn't go out. This PG&E is threatening to turn the power off for my neighborhood again, potentially right now. So I'm taking a chance. So I have some lines started. I'm now going to pick another direction. I can even shift my lines so that we get a little variety that can grow and evolve. And eventually, it's dinner time for the doggies, so they are making lots of noise. Just going to go in and just keep adding. This is kind of like what they call a Zentangle. You just add shapes and I can even add circles. Different size circles. Don't forget though, if you want to have floating shapes, you do need to have them go up to the edge of the other ones and go off the page too. It's part of the illusion. If they avoid touching these lines, then it doesn't quite work. Look, we need one over there, I can tell. So it looks like it just keeps going back in space. So this plays around with positive and negative space. So I'm going to keep working on this. And I want to have little curly Q shapes. You can. I want to change it up, and I also want to repeat some of my lines. I want to put some of these polka dots over here somewhere, or maybe over here. And definitely I like stripes. Stripes are fun. This is kind of like our value scale in here. Still not outlining my leaf, not, I want it to just look like a floating white shape in there when I'm done. Okay. And maybe I want to thicken some of my lines. I want to stick with the same pen. So you are going to work on this drawing, get as far as you can today. We can continue it next week if we need to. But the idea is to kind of have fun drawing, play around with the weight of your lines, and with the positive and negative space. If I get enough done of this before I finish editing this video, I will include it. All right.